The pandemic, Red Sea diversions, and tariffs. The supply chain has been hit by multiple disruptions in recent years. Hi, this is Marcus Hand, editor of Seatrade Maritime News, and today you're going to be hearing from Niki Frank of DHL Global Forwarding about multi-sourcing strategies and logistics. Welcome to the podcast, Niki. Could you briefly introduce yourself and your role at DHL to our listeners?
Yeah, good morning, Marcus. Thanks for having me. So Niki Frank is my name. I'm the CEO for Asia Pacific at DHL Global Forwarding. And I'm sure most of your listeners would know the DHL group, but maybe not all of the details of the structure. So we have 5 business units in the DHL group. Our predominantly German post and parcel business, our DHL Express business. So these are the courier guys for time-sensitive shipments. We have DHL Supply Chain. These are our contract logistics specialists. DHL E-commerce. They are, as the name suggests, looking after cross-border e-commerce businesses. And then DHL Global Forwarding, which I'm a part of. We are the international freight forwarding specialist, taking care of all air freight, ocean freight, and industrial project shipments, with everything linked to it, like customs clearance, etc. And in Asia Pacific, the region I'm responsible for, we cover 20 countries from Pakistan in the west to Fiji in the east, and all the way from New Zealand in the south up to Japan, China in the north.
That is a big region.
It is a massive region indeed, yes.
Okay, now great. I think on the business you're in, one of the things we've been sort of characterized the last kind of few years has been supply chain disruption and multiple disruptions. And one of the ways of dealing with those has been the China Plus One strategy. And I think one of the things I wanted to talk to you about today was a recent white paper by DHL entitled China Plus X, the new global supply chain, that suggested this was not enough. Could you explain more to our listeners about this?
Yeah, I think over the last few years, we've seen an evolution from China Plus One to really China Plus X, what our white paper is about. And I would say the term China Plus One started to gain a lot of prominence during the first Trump administration, when the first tariffs were imposed on China and a lot of those trade disputes started. So many of our customers and many companies overall started to look into this and think about their dependence on China as a sourcing or manufacturing location and what they could do to de-risk and diversify away from China. So they were starting to look at shifting some of their production to another country. Then when the COVID pandemic hit, a lot of customers actually realized how difficult it can be if you are dependent on one country as a sourcing or manufacturing location. And those plans that many companies started to develop during the first Trump administration, they took them out of the drawer again and actually started implementing those plans. But they also realized, again, putting kind of half of your eggs or most of your business into just one other country also bears certain risks. And it's hard to find one substitute for China. So that's when it evolved and they were starting to look at multiple countries, multiple alternative sourcing and production locations. And with what we are seeing over the last several months, I would say, the geopolitical tensions, the very volatile macroeconomic environment, customers are realizing indeed that looking at plus X, so more than just one country to diversify their sourcing and manufacturing, is something that is beneficial for their supply chain to give them more resilience and also more alternatives. And overall, while the focus often is on the plus and the other countries, I think we also need to remember that China is and will remain an essential part in global supply chains, in global manufacturing footprint. So that's why it's China plus X.
Yeah, that's good not to sort of forget about the China part of that component, which is obviously very big. When it comes to a multi-country kind of sourcing strategy like that, what factors do companies and shippers need to take into account?
Yeah, so in our white paper, we've identified basically 5 dimensions or 5 factors that are crucial when looking at your diversification of the supply chain and the China Plus X. It is transport infrastructure, cost, it's the general infrastructure in the country, it's people, and it's the regulatory environment. So when we talk about transport infrastructure, it's obviously available capacity for operational logistics, trade routes, trade linkages. Is there enough aircraft capacity? Are there enough shipping line connections covering the country or the countries? When we look at the cost, it's obviously in the first place an investment that companies do when they diversify their supply chain and shift their manufacturing to other countries. Part of it is labor cost, but there's also investments into new factories, and ultimately it's a total cost consideration. And companies also need to look at the return on investment if they move part of their production. The third point on infrastructure. It's both the physical as well as the digital infrastructure a country offers. So it's the ports, the airports, the roads, the railway infrastructure. Is there enough capacity? Is there enough space? But it's also the digital infrastructure. So how well is the country digitally connected? How good is the broadband capacity? How is the digital environment, I would say. And then on the people side, one is obviously the availability of labor, of talented, qualified labor, and the skill level. So we also see often there's a first instinct to look into just what's the labor cost and then think about going to that country. But it also depends on the productivity of that labor. So if you don't have the skill set required or enough of those skilled and talented people, you might end up employing a lot more people than you would in another country. It's the right combination of skills and talent and productivity. And lastly, on the regulatory environment, this is looking at obviously customs procedures, ease of doing business. Are there any free trade agreements that might be beneficial? Are there certain government subsidies or incentives that companies can tap into? And also how stable overall is the regulatory environment? Is it something that has been changing frequently and you can't really rely on the stability in the country? Or is it generally a stable environment that shows progressive movements in terms of some of the regulations?
So there's a lot of factors to take into account there. And when you've got something like this sort of multi-shoring type of model, it's obviously going to become more complex with the supply chain. So how can this be managed in terms of logistics? And you mentioned cost there, so cost effectiveness as well.
You're right. If you obviously move from just one sourcing location or one manufacturing location to multiple, it adds complexity to the supply chain, which in the first step also probably adds cost to it. But I think it's too short-sighted to just look at the short-term cost and the immediate investment. We also need to look at the longer-term benefits and impact of really diversifying the risk. There might be, instances like we've seen during the COVID pandemic when China went into lockdown. So a lot of companies faced shortages of essential supplies. And sometimes it was just a little gadget. It wasn't even the most expensive part in the production. But when you can't get these parts out of a country or when you can't get access to them and your whole production stops, that causes tremendous cost. So I think it's looking at the overall picture there and the total cost over time, also weighing in the flexibility and the agility that these multiple sourcing locations give you, that you also have more freedom to maneuver and to shift production from one location to the other. This is where the benefit comes in. And yes, with the right planning, we're doing this with the right partners. It can be done in an efficient way, even though there's certainly added complexity to the supply chain.
You mentioned COVID, and we've seen a variety of geopolitical events impacting shipping logistics. We've had the pandemic, we've had the Red Sea crisis, and now tariffs. How can resilience be built into the supply chain in such an unpredictable global environment?
So I think one lesson many players in the industry, shippers, carriers, freight forwarders like us learned that this flexibility and also the resilience really is necessary. So the model we used to have before, maybe as lean as possible and as efficient and cheap as possible, is no longer the right model, right? So we need to build resilience, and some of that resilience comes through more alternatives, and in part you can say through a duplication, right? Not just related to your suppliers, so having multiple sourcing options, multiple countries, multiple vendors, but also in terms of your logistics and your transportation options, having alternative providers there, but also looking at alternative transportation modes, looking at multimodal solutions. And this is something that has seen a strong revival during the last few years. So while before, or when times was, say, normal, still pre-pandemic, it used to be either air or ocean, depending on what goods you ship. But over the last few years, we've seen a lot of multimodal solutions, sea-air or air-sea solutions, including rail into the mix, etc. So building that resilience in your sourcing and in your logistics is important. Another key factor that is really important is visibility and transparency. I think that's also a lesson that the industry has learned over the last few years, that you need to have as good and as accurate and as timely information about your shipments as possible. And that's where, say, almost real-time visibility helps, having the right platforms, the right systems, leveraging technologies like IoT sensors, tracking devices, but also predictive arrival, leveraging AI to get more visibility really about the flows and the movements of your cargo. Those are aspects that are becoming more and more common when we talk with our customers.
Okay. Presumably some of those things like the visibility and so forth are things that DHL Forwarding can provide to its clients.
Yes, absolutely. So we have a customer-facing platform which we call My DHLi, which not only provides, I would say, something that's standard by now, a track and trace, but it also has a lot of analytics built in. It has reporting, it has a lot of analytics on the data when it comes to spend, when it comes to the trade routes. It has a full-fledged report and data set on sustainability, so on the carbon footprint that the shipments incur. And it has a lot of customization options so that customers can really tailor this to their needs and integrate it also into their TMS or into their ERP systems.
Okay, great. Now, looking at the sort of contracting part and working with a partner like DHL Global Forwarding, one of the characteristics we've seen of this market in recent years has been these huge sort of swings in the freight market, tightness of capacity. Can contracting with someone like yourselves help to kind of smooth that out?
Absolutely. I mean, when we work with our customers, we offer them, I would say, the full spectrum of options, right? From spot pricing and spot quotations, very short term, to, say, 3 months contracts, 6 months, 12 months, but even longer term fixed contracts, which give you a certain guarantee to have capacity. They give you a guarantee on the pricing, on the rate levels, but they also obviously come with a stronger commitment on the customer side. So it's a bit like, in the airline industry, this has existed, I would say, since many years, that you have block space agreements where you commit to a fixed capacity, and whether you show up with your cargo for the flight or not, you pay for that capacity. And throughout the pandemic, these type of contracts have also gained a lot more attention in the ocean freight world, with longer term commitments, but also guaranteed capacity from the carriers and guaranteed equipment, which, as we all know, has also been a challenge throughout the last few years in certain moments, that the containers were not at the right place at the right time.
Yeah, there's been a lot of challenges around things like that. Now, one of the things I couldn't not cover here would be the Trump administration and what's going on with tariffs, which seems a very fluid situation as we're sort of speaking at the moment.
Yeah.
Is it possible that a multi-shoring strategy can sort of help hedge against that fluid situation?
Yeah, it certainly can, because if you have more options, if you have alternative sourcing locations, if you use alternative countries for your production, you might mitigate some of the tariffs that are levied on some markets. Obviously, if we look at some of the proposals that going into a reciprocal tariff scheme where every country will be levied with tariffs, that advantage might go away a little bit if every country faces higher tariffs. But overall, having more options, having more solutions gives you flexibility. And I can give you an example, obviously without going into any customer names or specifics here, but we do have customers that had those plans to diversify, and they have started to implement these plans during the COVID pandemic and afterwards to build up alternative sourcing and manufacturing locations. And when the election results were clear at the beginning of November last year, they called us and said, our shifting of capacity from China into Vietnam, which we planned for 26 and 27, we want to accelerate that. We want to do this in 25. After the inauguration, when the first set of tariffs was announced, and it was announced that China will get an extra 10% in tariffs, they came back and said, it's actually not as bad as we thought. So we're not going to shift that much to Vietnam. We're going to keep more in China than we thought. So having these flexibilities to allocate your production to certain markets, that is something where that multi-sourcing, multi-shoring can help you.
That must be actually quite challenging from your side, though, if you've got customers who are constantly kind of changing.
It absolutely is. And it sounds easy on the customer side, which also is not. Obviously, building that network and that footprint of manufacturing capacity also has certain costs. But depending on, obviously, the volumes that we're talking about, you can't just switch that on from one day to the other, especially when we talk about markets like Vietnam, Thailand, Indonesia, where the markets are not yet there to take up all of that capacity that China has, right? So then the right planning, it's hopefully involving us early enough so that we can also adjust our capacities, that we can look into flight operations to bring in additional capacity into those markets, and that we can also talk with our shipping line partners to secure additional capacity for our customers.
There's obviously a lot of different factors to take into account there. Now, one of the things we were chatting about just before we started this episode was, well, the latter half of last year, we started to see some predictability in the market in terms of the Red Sea situation and diversions. Coming into 2025, we've seen that potential for shipping lines to go back to transiting the Red Sea and the Suez Canal. What sort of challenges lie ahead with that if they do return and the readjustment of networks?
Yeah, I think the Red Sea situation, or overall the geopolitical situation in the Middle East, is a very fragile one at the moment. And while there are some talks about resuming transit through the Suez Canal, I also was recently at TPM in Long Beach, really one of the largest maritime conferences. I think the general sentiment there was, we don't expect a quick resuming of the Suez Canal as a transit route. There might be still, like there was before, some carriers, some vessels that go through it. But at least for the first half of this year, nobody really expects any change there. And whether or not the Suez Canal will become a viable option again depends first and foremost, I think, on the geopolitical situation, whether we will see a lasting peace situation in the Middle East. And second is the insurance premium that carriers have to pay right now. I think in the first phase, what carriers were telling us is there wasn't even insurance available. Now insurance is available again, but it is still prohibitively expensive to take that route on a consistent basis. So it really is a very fragile situation. But if we assume for a moment that there will be a peace and the insurance premium will come down again and the Suez will become a viable option, I think what we can expect in the first place is, again, a little bit of a chaos, because shipping lines will have vessels that just the day before the Suez was announced to be open again, that have taken a route around the Cape, and then you have other vessels going through the Suez. So you will have more vessels arriving, especially in European ports at the same time, where you will face capacity challenges again. Now, there's a lot of customers, a lot of shippers who are hoping that once the Suez opens, we will see overcapacity on behalf of the ocean carriers, and that should lead to a drop in rates. And yes, certainly it will free up capacity because they no longer need to take the longer transit around the Cape. But I think an interesting aspect that we also need to look into is, where is the real bottleneck when it comes to the capacity at the moment? So we certainly have a more balanced equation between supply of ocean capacity and demand right now. And if more capacity comes in, theoretically that should lead to an oversupply. But the real bottleneck that we actually see in the whole equation at the moment is port capacity. Even at today, with the transit time around the Cape, right? So with supply and demand balanced, we are seeing many ports around the world that are congested and where we have longer dwell times, longer waiting times. So if you now imagine there's more supply, and it doesn't naturally just lead to dropping rates, because if the ports can't handle the additional capacity, it is also of no use. So I wouldn't say that it is a given that rates will drop back to pre-pandemic levels once the Suez Canal opens. We don't really expect that.
That's interesting, actually. I don't think that's something you see factored into the analyst forecast for that market, the port congestion part.
Yeah, I mean, it's an aspect that is sometimes overlooked, because it's very easy to look at the shipping line capacity and how many container vessels they have and how much capacity and what's the demand, right? So, or how is capacity growing and how is demand growing? But we've seen this over the last couple of months, right? In China, a lot of ports, but also European ports who are facing delays. We know the situation in North America is also quite fragile. We've seen this throughout the discussions on the potential labor action, which fortunately was avoided. But we also know that North American ports are not the most efficient ones. So, it doesn't take much to kind of throw the system out of balance again and lead to congestion.
So a lot of factors to take into account. Now, to wrap this up, and all those different factors, what would be the 3 key things listeners should bear in mind when managing their supply chains in this current environment?
I would say it's flexibility, resilience, and visibility. And what I mean by that is try to make your supply chain as flexible as possible, try to remain as agile as possible. On the one hand, this covers the China plus X topic, or generally diversification, having multiple sourcing options, having multimodal options, and also from a contracting perspective, many customers are right now looking at the new contract season. It's also important to keep certain flexibility there, to not put all of your eggs in one basket, to not maybe lock in everything with a 12-month contract, but with the volatility and the uncertainty in the market, where there is an expectation that rates might come down, maybe there's a risk that another disruption happens and rates might go up, but you want to keep a certain flexibility, also to have some of your allocation not fixed, but to play a bit with the market and maybe use NVOs, use freight forwarders, and not only direct carriers to give you that flexibility. Also, for example, when it comes to the reshuffling of the alliances, right, you want to tap into the option to use all of the alliances as an ocean freight shipper, and there a freight forwarder like DHL can help you to offer those solutions and not just one carrier. Resilience, I think we spoke about a lot, building those alternative sourcing, manufacturing locations, looking at alternative transport modes, really planning in scenarios to say, what happens if the Suez opens? How am I going to route my cargo? What happens if it continues like it is right now? What happens if in one of my major manufacturing locations, if the country is levied with tariffs from the US, right? What is my plan of action? How do I react to this? And the third part on the visibility is really about getting as much of that real-time visibility, the data, using our tools and systems to get predictive arrival times, to get alerts when disruptions happen, be it natural disasters or port strikes or any other kind of curveball that can be thrown into your supply chain. And ultimately, I think it's working with partners like us, like DHL Global Forwarding, who can help you across the world as a global provider, being local with our own teams on the ground, having that technology and that access to capacity of all major shipping lines and airlines to provide you with those solutions.
Okay, great. Some fantastic advice there. Niki, thank you so much for taking the time to talk to our listeners today.
My pleasure. Thank you for the invitation, Marcus.
Thank you for listening to the Seatrade Maritime podcast, and we look forward to joining you on the next episode.